Sarah's world ended on a Tuesday morning in 1867. The wagon train stretched across the Dakota plains like a broken promise, smoke still rising from the wreckage. She was 12 years old, hiding beneath her mother's quilts while gunfire echoed across the grasslands. When silence finally came, it brought something worse than fear. It brought emptiness. Her parents lay still beside the overturned wagon. Her younger brother was gone, vanished in the chaos. She was alone in a landscape so vast it seemed to swallow sound itself. For 3 days, she survived on creek water and the few biscuits she found scattered in the dirt. Other survivors from the attack had fled eastward, but Sarah couldn't move. Her legs wouldn't carry her away from the only graves she'd been able to dig with her small hands. On the 4th morning, riders appeared on the horizon. Sarah's heart hammered as she recognized the silhouettes, Lakota warriors, their horses moving like thunder across the plain. She should have run. Instead, she stood beside her parents' graves, too exhausted for fear. The warriors circled her, their faces unreadable. One dismounted, an older man with gray streaking his long hair and eyes that seemed to measure her soul. He spoke words she didn't understand, his voice surprisingly gentle. When she didn't respond, he picked up her mother's torn shawl from the ground and carefully draped it around Sarah's shoulders. The gesture broke something inside her, and tears finally came. The warrior, whose name she would later learn was Chief Mtawandi, Soaring Bear, lifted her onto his horse. As they rode toward the setting sun, Sarah looked back one last time at everything she'd lost, not knowing she was riding toward everything she would become. The Lakota camp sprawled across a river valley like a living thing, dozens of teepees arranged in careful circles that spoke of generations of tradition. Sarah clung to Chief Mtawandi's back as they entered, feeling hundreds of eyes upon her. Children stopped their games. Women paused their work. Warriors emerged from their lodges, hands moving to weapons they didn't draw. The chief spoke loudly in Lakota, his voice carrying authority that needed no translation. He gestured to Sarah, then to himself, making sweeping motions that seemed to encompass the entire village. Whatever he said caused murmurs to ripple through the crowd. An older woman approached, her face weathered like ancient stone but her eyes sharp with intelligence. She examined Sarah with the thoroughness of someone appraising a horse, then spoke rapidly to the chief. Their exchange grew heated, the woman's voice rising in what sounded like protest. But Mtawandi remained calm, responding with words that gradually softened her expression. Finally, the woman sighed and beckoned Sarah to follow. The chief gently pushed Sarah forward, nodding encouragement. The woman, whose name was Winona, led Sarah to a teepee at the village's edge. Inside, it smelled of sage and tanned leather, so different from the canvas and wood smoke of her wagon home. Winona handed her a bowl of stew, rich with meat and wild onions, and watched as Sarah devoured it. Then she pointed to a pile of furs in the corner and mimed sleeping. Sarah understood. She had a place to rest, at least for tonight. But sleep wouldn't come. Outside, she heard voices debating in urgent tones. Some sounded angry, others pleading. She understood none of the words but grasped their meaning. Her presence was controversial. She was a symbol of the people who were taking their land, killing their buffalo, breaking their treaties. Why would they shelter her? As exhaustion finally pulled her under, Sarah wondered if she would wake at all. Morning brought clarity, though not comfort. Chief Mtawandi summoned Sarah to the center of the village where a council had gathered. Respected elders sat in a semicircle, their expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. The chief spoke at length, his hands gesturing to the east where the wagon train had burned, then to Sarah, then to his own heart. He was telling her story, she realized, but also something more, something about himself. An elder with a scar across his cheek stood abruptly, jabbing a finger toward Sarah while speaking harsh words that needed no translation. Others joined the argument, the volume rising until Mtawandi raised his hand for silence. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of grief. He pointed to an empty space beside his teepee where grass grew thicker than elsewhere. A grave, Sarah understood. Someone he had lost. Then Winona stood, which seemed to surprise everyone. She spoke briefly but with fierce conviction, pointing at Sarah and then at several children in the crowd. She grabbed Sarah's thin arm, holding it up to show her malnourished state, then mimicked a mother feeding a child. Her meaning crystallized. Sarah was just a child who needed care, regardless of her skin color. The debate continued for hours under the climbing sun. Sarah sat silently, understanding that her fate was being decided by people who had every reason to hate what she represented. Finally, Mtawandi stood and made a pronouncement that silenced all dissent. From the reactions, Sarah understood he had invoked some right or privilege that couldn't be challenged. Several elders looked displeased but nodded acceptance. The chief approached Sarah and placed his hand on her head, speaking words that sounded like both promise and warning. Winona smiled for the first time, a crack in her stern facade. Sarah had been chosen. She would stay. The seasons turned and Sarah changed with them. Winona became her teacher, a demanding instructor who accepted no half-efforts. Sarah learned to tan hides until her hands bled and cramped, scraping away flesh and working in the brain mixture that softened the leather. She learned to identify plants, which healed, which poisoned, which sustained. She learned to move through tall grass without disturbing it, to read weather in the color of the sky, to predict where game would shelter from storms. The language came slowly, each word a small victory. Mi for water. Wichoni for life. Tiwahe for family. The children mocked her pronunciation at first, giggling at her clumsy tongue. But Sarah persisted, listening intently to every conversation, repeating words until they felt natural. Within months, she could make herself understood. Within a year, she dreamed in Lakota. Chief Mtawandi watched her progress with quiet approval. He never demanded affection or forced closeness, but gradually Sarah found herself seeking his presence. He would tell stories by the fire, tales of Ictomy the trickster spider, of buffalo that emerged from caves beneath the earth, of the time when animals and humans spoke the same language. His voice carried wisdom that transcended words, teaching her the values his people held sacred: courage, generosity, respect, wisdom. One evening, as winter approached, Sarah helped Winona prepare the chief's meal. The old woman paused in her work and spoke seriously. He lost his daughter 3 winters past. Sickness from the white man's forts. She would be your age now. Sarah's hands stilled over the grinding stone. He sees her in you sometimes. It brings him pain but also healing. You understand? Sarah nodded, tears blurring her vision. She understood loss. She understood the ghost ache of missing someone who would never return. And she understood that somehow, impossibly, she and this grieving chief were mending each other's broken hearts. 2 years passed like water flowing over stones, reshaping everything it touched. Sarah was 14 now, no longer the hollow-eyed orphan but a young woman of 2 worlds. She wore doeskin dresses decorated with quill work that Winona taught her to create. She could ride as well as any Lakota youth, read the stars for navigation, and knew 100 plants by their roots alone. The village children no longer saw her as different. She was simply Wakinyela Scar, White Thunder Girl, the name given to her after she'd fearlessly climbed a tree during a lightning storm to rescue a young boy's pet magpie. But the world outside their valley was changing, and not for the better. Soldiers came more frequently to the reservation boundaries, their promises as empty as their treaties. Settlers pushed westward in growing numbers, hungry for land the government had sworn would remain Lakota forever. Tensions mounted with each broken promise, each new restriction on where the people could hunt or travel. One spring morning, a messenger arrived with devastating news. The government was demanding all Lakota bands report to agencies, surrendering their weapons and accepting confinement to reservations a fraction of their original territory. Those who refused would be considered hostile. Chief Mtawandi called a council, his face grave with the weight of impossible choices. Stay free and face extermination. Submit and watch their way of life die slowly. Sarah sat beside Winona during the debate, her heart breaking as she listened to proud warriors argue whether to fight or surrender. She thought of her birth parents, killed in the violence between worlds. She thought of the Lakota who had given her life when they could have taken it. These divisions, this suffering, it was all so senseless. When Mtawandi finally spoke, his voice carried both strength and sorrow. The band would move to the reservation, he decided, but they would not surrender their dignity or forget who they were. They would adapt, survive, and teach their children the old ways in secret. He looked directly at Sarah as he spoke, and she understood. She was proof that people could belong to more than one world, that survival sometimes meant transformation rather than destruction. That night, sitting by the fire outside his teepee, the chief finally called Sarah Chuansi, daughter. It was the first time he'd used the word, and it settled into her chest like a coal that would burn warm forever. She had been an orphan belonging to no one, lost between worlds. Now she belonged to herself, to this family, to this place she had learned to call home. Her journey had taught her a truth deeper than blood, that family wasn't what you were born into but what you chose, what chose you, and what you fought to keep when everything else was taken away. As stars wheeled overhead in their eternal patterns, Sarah knew that whatever came next, she would face it as a daughter of 2 peoples, belonging fully to both and apologizing for neither.